Hello and welcome to this second edition of What the Heck. My name is Dave Palmer, and I want to explain to you first of all the whole idea of this in case you didn't watch the first What the Heck video. The premise is since this site is dedicated to the philosophy and theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, especially as taught through the Summa Theologia, the premise is that in the 13th century, when St. Thomas Aquinas died and had written a pretty big volume of books, especially the Summa Theologia, the church had put together, thanks to St. Thomas Aquinas and all the giants that he leaned on, a good systematic theology and philosophy that really has served as the gold standard ever since. It wasn't perfect. There's certainly some problems with the Summa and with Thomistic philosophy, but it was really good. And like I said, for 700 years now, it has been what the church has relied on as her philosophy and her theology, and people continue to go back to it. What has happened, though, is that since then, it has been chipped apart, and we get to where we are today as a culture, where you got to admit, it's just nuttiness. I mean, there are things that people believe and people propose in our culture today that just rudimentary, I mean, second graders would know that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, and just basic things about natural law that have been called into question, and some of the laws of our country, even the Supreme Court and around the world, just don't make sense. And so the whole point of this is that many of us are putting our hands up and saying, what the heck? And I know heck is a euphemism for a word hell, and I would argue that hell has been unleashed. I mean, there are forces in the culture right now that really are diabolical. And so I don't use that word lightly, but it is an expression that people are like, well, it's a little bit comical in a sense, where you're like, well, what is going on? How did this happen? And we can't blame Hollywood or the internet or the more recent things that have happened that have kind of been toxic in our culture. You got to go way back and see how ideas had consequences. So last video we did William of Ockham. He was a Franciscan priest. He was excommunicated, had some pretty errant philosophical opinions. Today it's John Wycliffe, and I got to admit, I don't know if it's Wickliffe or Wycliffe, but I'm going to call him Wickliffe because I think that's what it is. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but it's not terribly important as far as the ideas that he had. You'll find that Wycliffe, like William of Ockham, was a rebel. Okay, he definitely mixed it up with the church. The church excommunicated him posthumously, and you'll see what else they did with him that really showed their disdain for him. And he really did not play nicely with the church. Okay, maybe some of this was justified, and maybe there was corruption, as there always is in the church, but you'll see that he was a problem. He was a thorn in the side to the Pope and the church at large in the 14th century. You see that he crossed over with William of Ockham for about 25, 30 years, right? So I'm not sure if they knew each other. He certainly would have been influenced. They're both Englishmen. And so let me go straight to the first slide that shows that John Wycliffe was an English scholastic philosopher and theologian, whereas William of Ockham dealt more with philosophy. I think Wycliffe is more theology. I don't see him as a great philosopher or having great philosophical ideas. Most of what he talked about was theological in nature, if you understand the difference. He was rebellious. He was a dissident priest at odds with the church, and so, like I said, he was a rebel in his time for sure. Advocated translation of the Bible into the common vernacular language. Now, that in and of itself is not that big of a deal. I mean, I read my Bible in English. I don't read it in Greek and Hebrew, but at the time, that was more controversial. And of course, that may have been a precursor to what happened at Vatican II, where they changed the Latin Mass universally into the vernacular. So that certainly, again, all these thinkers have influence on future um, policy and rules within the church and in society as well. Now, here's where it becomes problematic. He advocated predestination. Now, we know that the church is not does not have a problem with single predestination, where God predestines us in a sense, not without compromising free will. But I believe that Wycliffe believed in double predestination, and that's a problem. And this is what influenced Calvin and Okay, iconoclasm, that has to do with images, statues, against it. And attacking the veneration of saints, which would have to do with iconoclasm as well. The sacraments, I mean, you can see how this guy ran adrift. Requiem masses, transubstantiation, when you call into question the very presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. I mean, that's some serious stuff. Now, that had been officially defined back in the 11th century, and so, he's calling this into question now. Monasticism, the existence of the papacy, and so, I mean, he went on, he went there. I mean, and you'll see in this first bullet point here, he influenced the Protestant Reformation. What we're going to find, interestingly, is that this is 14th century. The 15th century was quiet. There really are not a lot of big names in the 15th century. And then when it comes to 16th century, I mean, it goes nuts. And then that's when you have Martin Luther, and that's when you'll see our next video, in fact, is going to jump a whole century. So Wickliffe set the stage, and Wickliffe was a rebel. And then it kind of percolated for about 100 years, and of course there would have been lesser known people that called things into question, or debated against some of the Thomistic thought and philosophy, but for the most part, not so. But when it came to the 16th century, it was like the diabolical was unleashed. All right, you got to take into consideration the Black Death reached England in the summer of 1348. This killed a lot of people, and this changes people. And one person said that, speaking of Wickliffe, he had a very gloomy view in regard to the condition and prospect of the human race. He believed that the world was going to come to an end at the end of the 14th century. So you imagine, some people are that way today. They see what's going on in the culture and the world, and they think, okay, it's coming to an end. I don't personally fall into that camp, but it could. But I don't necessarily think it's. There's always been rough times, right? He attacked the temporal rule of the clergy, the collection of indulgences, and simony. Does that sound familiar? That's when Martin Luther is going to rail against, 150 years after Wycliffe dies. And so this is setting the stage for rebellion. This is setting the stage for a all-out revolution against the church. He claimed that the church had fallen into sin. Of course, we see that today. The church is always in sin to some degree or another. Peter Damian wrote a book about much of the same issues that we're dealing with in the church. He thought the church was too wealthy and that it ought, therefore, to give up all of its property. You hear people say that today. Why are there all these beautiful paintings and $1 million, pieces of art in the Vatican? Sell it, give it to the poor. Okay, so the church had had enough, and the church was like, okay, this guy's a little crazy. On 22nd of May 1377, just about 7 years before Wickliffe died, Pope Gregory XI sent 5 copies of a bull against Wickliffe. So they're starting to take action. He continued to write and reject transubstantiation, and that's a big issue. I mean, some of this stuff is not as important, but transubstantiation, it just cuts to the very heart of Catholicism and our faith that Jesus left the Eucharist, his own body and blood for us after he died. I mean, that's a big deal. He said Christians should rely on the Bible rather than on the teachings of popes and clerics. Again, sounds like Martin Luther, doesn't it? And Martin Luther's not even born yet. This is a long time before Martin Luther's born. He believed in the invisible church of the elect. All right, so this is, again, Calvin kind of stuff. And you can see, again, I don't mean to be repeating myself, but the influence that he had on the reformers who are going to come in the 16th century. He rejected the concept of purgatory and disapproval of clerical celibacy. So this guy was all over the place. Scripture, the only authoritative, reliable guide to the truth about God. Again, sola scriptura. There was a big revolt in 1381, just a few years before Wycliffe died, and it had been, many people alleged that it was stirred up by Wycliffe because he was railing against the wealth in the church, and kind of like French Revolution stuff that would come centuries later. All right, so he died in 1384, and the Council of Constance declared Wycliffe a heretic. All right, 20 years after he died. And it took that long. It didn't happen while he was alive. They banned his writings, effectively excommunicating him and retroactively making him a forerunner of Protestantism. All right, there were no Protestants in the 14th century. This didn't come until 16th century, but he, for all intents and purposes, was a Protestant. All right, he just didn't give himself that name, and it wasn't really until Martin Luther posted the 95 Theses that the Protestant Revolution really took off. Now watch this. Wycliffe's corpse was exhumed and burned, and the ashes cast into the river Swift. Okay, we're serious. I mean, this is um, so. Like I said at the beginning, this guy was a rebel, and again, you got to fault him for a lot of what he did. He definitely influenced the Protestant Reformation. Would it have still happened without him? Maybe. Maybe it would have been delayed a century or so. But this guy was a rabble rouser. And again, as we look at the issues in the church today and issues in the world overall in our country, you got to say, what the heck? You know, who started this? And like I said a moment ago in the next video, we're going to skip all the way through the 15th century, go straight to the 16th. There's going to be a lot of videos in the 16th century because that's when things started to get really nutty. And we will spend quite a few videos on figures of the 16th century, and then the 17th and the 18th and the 19th, and it keeps snowballing, and it gets worse. And then of course in 1879, Pope Leo XIII writes Eternity Patris, the restoration of Christian philosophy according to the mind of St. Thomas Aquinas. And he's basically saying, whoa, 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 what has happened to our world? What has happened to our church? He writes the St. Michael the Archangel prayer and says we need to take it back. That's the whole point of these videos, is you got to understand how we got to where we are today in order to take it back. The solution, I believe, is studying Thomistic philosophy, an ordered, sane philosophy. Not everybody agrees, but I certainly do, and hopefully you do as well. All right, that's going to do it. This is What the Heck number 2 with John Wycliffe, and please comment, start a conversation. I'd love to hear from you, and thank you very much for watching. God bless you.